And then smart property. We're already talking through this one later. So either way, when we start talking about manufacturing, probably in order of precedence, smart contract, smart property. Start thinking logistics, supply chain, stuff like that, where essentially someone's saying, you know, my comment earlier of someone agrees that I'm going to ship 1 million widgets to you. When it shows up on your loading dock and you register that it's there, it automatically completes the contract. We've seen people doing facility timeshares with these. Hey, I need to use that warehouse during my surge time, which is normally January to March, but if I own it, it's going to be empty the next 9 months. Well, why don't we basically timeshare the facility? Stuff like that. So it's essentially agreements on the transfer of physical goods. My favorite on this one, we've already seen the first wave of the tech geeks doing this. So imagine the guys in Silicon Valley that essentially at this point all have silicon chips embedded in their brain. They're basically the geekiest of the geeks. These guys in some cases are multi-billionaires. I'm sure you guys have never heard of a will or property dispute amongst siblings go bad when a very, very wealthy parent dies. And allegations that the will has been manipulated or, you know, whatever it's going to be. Later in, you know, my later years when my mom got dementia, one of the kids that was caretaking her managed to get her to rewrite the will and leave everything. So a bunch of the geeks are using a blockchain for wills to publicly write their will, or in some cases what they do is they're writing their will electronically. They're creating a hash, a digital signature of the will, and they're publishing the hash on the blockchain. So when they die and somebody opens up the will, they'll mathematically validate that that document matches the hash. And if it is, all of the goods get distributed. If it doesn't, they know it was false. One of the guys in there literally said in his will, he wrote that if his will doesn't match, he doesn't want people trying to reconcile it, sort it, whatever, automatically all of his wealth is donated to charity. So what he's trying to do is reduce the odds that one of his kids is going to try and manipulate the will and then basically try and get it solved in court or whatever. He literally said if it doesn't validate, all of it goes to the Humane Society or something like that. So to me, this is pretty funny. But you're starting to see people use blockchain to sign physical goods. This is starting to get closer to what it means for you. So Walmart and IBM, this is already in the field, and we were talking with them. So Unilever, Nestle, Dole, whatever, they're using blockchain to track food. You guys have seen all the recalls coming out. We think something might be contaminated with E. coli or whatever. Has it ever crossed your mind, like, it's weird because, like, a head of lettuce, when they recall it because it might have E. coli in it, it usually is tied to one facility, one field, in some cases one part of one field, but they end up recalling 1 billion heads of lettuce. The reason they have to do that is because they don't have any idea where those heads of lettuce came from. So as soon as E. coli shows up in a supermarket for a head of lettuce from one of these agricultural companies, in a lot of cases, they can't tell you that head of lettuce came through this logistics area, this shipping area. It was processed in this factory, or it came from that field. They have no idea. They just know some batch of their head of lettuce has E. coli, but they have no way to delineate what is what, so they have to recall all of them. It costs them hundreds of millions of dollars to do so. So what they're doing now is, in the fields, literally they're doing proof of concepts in these, that as individual batches are coming out of the field of heads of lettuce, cucumber, whatever it might be, they go into these little smart containers where somebody scans. This container has these batches of heads of lettuce in, or whatever it's going to be. It's tracked all the way through their logistics supply, so into the cleaning facility, sorting facility, packing facility, shipping facility, all the way to the grocery store. And so now when all of a sudden they have to do a recall on a batch of Cheerios because there was allegations that the flour was contaminated, they literally can say, okay, in that supermarket, this batch of Cheerios, all of the individual components, we have the entire life cycle all the way back, and we can backtrack through and find out, okay, wait, we only have, it was this one facility that processed that flour that was in that batch. We only need to recall 10,000 boxes of Cheerios rather than 100 million. And what they can do that is because the entire record is signed all the way through. And the reason they do this in the blockchain, not in the general ledger, is because the end one, so if you're taking like General Mills, they just combine all the ingredients into their cereal. They got all their ingredients from 1,000 different suppliers. And in some cases, they got their ingredients from 100 different suppliers individually. The reason they're using a blockchain is because there's no central entity in the ecosystem. There are so many people in the ecosystem that are producing the food, processing it, combining it, shipping it, whatever, that there's no one authority that you'd point at and say, you're going to have the database of all the transactions. There's too many people. So they're writing it to the blockchain, and then what they did is they forced all of their suppliers to participate this in, or you're not allowed to give us goods anymore. So it essentially is forcing all the suppliers onto the blockchain early. But at this point, they literally can track the life cycle of an individual cucumber all the way through on the general ledger. Make sense?
Just with that example, the head of lettuce, how do they know that head of lettuce? Can they track it down to a single head of lettuce?
Yep.
Great.
Well, it's going to get down to some minute amount. So usually, like for the heads of lettuce, what they were doing, it's kind of funny when you say it, they look like laundry baskets with RFID chips in them. And so what they do is they know that head of lettuce was in this basket with other 50 heads of lettuce. And what they do is those heads of lettuce typically stick together all the way through the process, so they can track them all the way through. Now, once you start getting more technical, like if you guys happen to know a bunch of tier 2 auto parts manufacturers where it's individual physical pieces, you can literally track the individual piece all the way through. So really this comes down to how does it impact you guys? And this is what I want to get to before I kick it back open to open Q&A. So this is what we're seeing right now. Some of this is fully in play. Some of this is proof of concept, meaning that we have groups that are trying it out. And some of it's on the drawing board where you have group startups that are trying to solve these. Storing value. This is a little bit back to cryptocurrency, but not so much. What if I use specific coins to facilitate money transfers into different geographies? So right now, if I'm pulling my parts and I pull them from Mexico, China, Brazil, wherever it might be, Italy, I have to resolve all of those in the individual fiat money of those regions. What happens if you have an agreement amongst your supplier community that we've agreed to use this one cryptocurrency, whether it's something that's already out there like a Bitcoin or something you create yourself that's just a representation of a certain amount of capital, and every time I get something from you, we don't actually clear fiat cash. We just clear the coins. What you've essentially done is sidestepped a massive problem on trying to solve cross-border payments. The IRS has yet to weigh in on this, but from their point of view, as long as they can reconcile, and this is from their, what they've already done for cryptocurrency, as long as they can reconcile whatever that coin is that you're clearing in back to some type of physical wealth, and you pay the tax on whatever that is, their view on it was almost they don't care. As long as they get their chunk of change equated later, they're fine with it. Smart contracts, this is what I was talking about before. You got to be very, very careful. So especially if you're tier 1, tier 2, whatever that might be, you might say, well, I might not be large enough to force my suppliers to do this with me. What happens when GM, hint, Ford, hint, I mean, there's internal conversations in these groups right now to do this because they're watching what's going on in the food community, they're seeing how well it's working. What happens when they come down and dictate to you saying, we won't accept your parts unless you're on our blockchain and we can digitally sign where the parts are coming from? Well, all of a sudden you're like, well, crap, I need my suppliers to be on it. Well, suddenly you can watch how an entire community goes from 0 to 60 in one shot, where nobody's doing it to everybody does it, because whoever it is upstream dictates, thou shalt do this. Now, if all of a sudden they force you into this, now what you're doing is you're solving all of your shipping upstream with your auto parts, or with your suppliers on raw materials or whatever it's going to be. When your stuff shows up, we've already written a contract to the blockchain. It shows up, automatically you get paid once we validate it through, and then you do what you're doing, and then you ship it downstream to whoever's receiving your parts. That contract's in the blockchain. The second it shows up, it automatically clears. There is no auditing, validation, whatever. It literally is a mathematical agreement saying this thing shows up, the transaction occurs. That is the concept. Just so you know, it sounds funny. They are... Wait a minute, I just want to be careful. Yeah, I've been here a long time. I get that one as well. The auto parts and auto manufacturing community, you take it whatever you want, how mature you think you are in the payment space and speedy and whatever, you are light years ahead of where the food community was. Imagine paying individual farmers, work hands, all this other stuff in the field, and they are doing this in a really short period of time. If you have another community, let's say auto manufacturing, that's watching this as the example and seeing how quickly this industry can roll over to it, it's suggesting to them that they can do it pretty fast themselves. And again, when you're saying you're frustrated at how slow they are paying now, stop and think about it. If they all of a sudden dictate you're going to be on this blockchain where they're going to use smart contracts, and it says the second your goods show up, they have some store of value that's automatically allocated to you, and it's run by a computer, a mathematical equation, that it's done, it actually solves a problem for you. I agree, but again, remember my analogy of the mid-90s internet, where there are a bunch of companies sitting around looking at the internet and they're like, I don't understand what the hell that thing is. It's a fad. We're not going to do it. Where are all of them now? Blockchain almost has that same conversation going about it right now.
There's nothing that prevents them from saying the terms are still 30 days.
That's the agreement in the contract. Remember, the contract is the contract. Whatever the terms are, and again, for those of us that have an IT background and programming background, it's the concept of if, then, else. That's one of the most basic structures in computing. If this, then this. If not that, then something else. That's what the contract says. So whatever you agree on, that's what occurs. But what you're looking at it is inherently it's going to get faster once you start removing all the human transactions out of it. Smart property, same thing. This is what I was talking through before. Transfer of goods, where essentially it's a version of a smart contract that says, I am allocating this thing to you. We're already starting to see proofs of concepts around doing car titles, financing, everything else getting written to the blockchain. The ones we're seeing in the smart property area that's really fun is we are starting to see 3D printing get tied to the blockchain, where essentially we've had people that are standing up these big 3D printing shops that are trying to say you don't need to do this stuff internally, your own manufacturing stuff. If you send something to us, we have the latest, greatest equipment. We will print that thing faster, cheaper for you, whatever it's going to be, whatever. There's this fear that you don't want to send your intellectual property to that group because what happens if my CAD drawings get exposed or whatever it's going to be? Well, if it's on the blockchain and everything's digitally signed all the way through, the data doesn't move. The design you want printed doesn't move without being digitally signed. And what you do is you don't actually write the CAD drawing to the blockchain. You create a digital signature of the design, sign saying, I gave this file to them, this design. They print it. If that file ever gets moved anywhere else, it's recorded in the blockchain. Because the way they're doing this is nothing can move without being written to the blockchain. So all of a sudden, it's opening this concept of you literally can lease borrowed time on massive shared 3D printing sites without cross-contaminating your intellectual property. So there's a group that's doing this in Silicon Valley. The aircraft industry is all over it. It is massively expensive for the Boeings of the world and Lockheeds and some of these others to each maintain their own fabrication facilities when in a lot of cases they're producing parts that are almost exactly the same. Well, if all of a sudden you end up with a shared manufacturing site where all of a sudden I didn't have to have a risk of my CAD drawings and designs getting shared with somebody else, but I committed to them and literally in a black box they print all my pieces and my pieces just show back up at my facility, this is massive savings for them. I saw another hand. Okay. And then storing information, again, life cycle of part tracking, what went where, when to the individual piece. The smart property, the other one there I want to call out is intellectual property, where I was talking about you trying to share yours with somebody else and a risk of losing it. Another thing that's coming up in the high-tech industry, and I can see it eventually coming up in the manufacturing industry, is what happens when somebody solves a problem for you and you want to use their intellectual property, but they don't want to sell it to you. They just want to let you borrow it, use it, whatever it's going to be for a period of time. On the blockchain, you literally can sign a contract acknowledging I'm borrowing this person's intellectual property for X amount of time, whatever it might be, X amount of iterations. We have people using it to, I'm sure you guys are all big rap and techno music fans in here. You guys, you've got that vibe to you. One of the big allegations in music is that everybody always samples everybody else's music. And there's always, you guys have seen over the last couple of years, there's all these people getting sued because their song sounded too much like somebody else's song or whatever it's going to be. And in some cases, they're like, no, this guy drunk at a party literally told me I could use his song in my next song, and the guy refutes it or whatever. Well, what they're actually doing this now is they literally have a blockchain where somebody can digitally sign a piece of intellectual property, music, poetry, art, whatever it's going to be, and allocate temporary use to somebody else for some period of time. Well, all of a sudden, once people started doing that for art, it was funny, that came first. Right behind it, people are like, oh, that's a great idea. Now they're doing it for source code and different high-tech solutions where they're saying, you can use my piece of source code. It's not open source. It's proprietary. It's mine. But I'm giving you permission to use it for X amount of time, X amount of iterations, whatever it might be, and the contract is digitally recorded. So you can see what this is starting to do is it's starting to open up these gateways on intellectual property and communications and sharing of data because it's taking away the risk that somebody can just flat out steal what I gave them. Ma'am. Well, you got to ask the fun questions. Yes, there's the first pending lawsuits, and here, give me 1 second. I can actually zoom this up a little bit. There's the first pending lawsuits about these on some of the earliest ones of, like, did somebody know what they were signing up for? Did they understand? What's odd is most of the disagreements have nothing to do with blockchain or the math. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to argue with math, you're going to lose. It's probably the only, in the entire universe, math is the only true thing. Most of the lawsuits aren't around the blockchain technology itself. What it is they were saying that the contract was misrepresented. Like, I agreed on this digital contract. So imagine you literally take a giant Word document that's a contract. All they did is they take a digital signature, a hash of it, and they write to the blockchain saying, we all agreed on this contract, and both parties sign it. The fact that you signed the contract isn't what's at point. You're saying that they misled you in the contract or whatever it was going to be. That's where the legal aspect's coming in. Honestly, you almost can throw the blockchain piece away. It's just normal contract law. So getting straight down into more pure manufacturing, this is kind of what's going on already. Supply chain management, tracking of shipping containers, imported products, everything that goes with it, registers of transactions. IBM, amongst several, Guard Time, and there's a few others, already have fully fledged blockchain solutions for this. It's almost one of those where they came up with a solution that's in search for a problem. The problem exists, but what they're trying to do is, as I was saying with the community, you can't just jump on blockchain by yourself. If nobody's in the pool with you, it doesn't work. So there's a bunch of groups that have already created fully fledged turnkey solutions for these. But the problem is they have to convince an entire industry or community to all jump onto the product at the same time. So what you're in now is you're in this bizarre stall state that everybody agrees that this is pretty slick and we should probably do it. Nobody wants to go first. It's real, at some point, it's going to get tipped, and that's what's going to happen with this. The Internet of Things and Industry 4.0 applications, this is starting to turn into a major play. Internet of Things, tiny little devices, webcams, cameras, whatever, embedded devices in cars, embedded devices on production facilities, on the production floors, on the front end of a hydraulic press, whatever it's going to be, tiny little computers. The issue on almost all of these is they're really difficult to secure, maintain, track, and see what's going on. There are blockchains coming out that do nothing but validate that the firmware and programming on an IoT device has not changed. It literally touches the device, runs a hash on it, meaning it creates a digital signature of what that device looks like right now, and checks it against the prior iteration on the blockchain to make sure it hasn't been changed. So who remembers Stuxnet? You guys remember that one when all the nuclear reactors in Iran suddenly melted down? Because somebody, mysteriously, us, rewrote the firmware on all of their embedded devices. So the firmware was lying to the operators on how fast the centrifuges were spinning or the temperature of the centrifuge or whatever it's going to be. And what happens is the operators never understood that the computer themselves was lying to them because somebody had programmed the device to lie to them. So now imagine you're running a production facility, remote facility, whatever it might be, and you say, well, I can't secure it. It's too small. It's too old. I can't buy all the software. I'd have to rip everything else out and replace with something new that's more secure, whatever. What happens if you just tied it to a blockchain that every couple of seconds it validated against the blockchain that it had not been altered? So essentially you can come up with a known good status for this embedded device, and literally within a second of somebody altering the production, you would instantly know that it had been changed. So you don't have to rip out 1,000 embedded devices. Or what happens when they're in vehicles where you end up with size or processing or space constraints, and you want to make sure that somebody hasn't written bad code to the car that suddenly says, hey, when you hit 80 miles an hour, lock up the brakes. So you're starting to see where blockchain is now getting used to validate embedded devices in a cheaper way than actually trying to secure the devices. So it's kind of bizarre to think about. And then 3D printing is what I was talking about, where we're starting to see a bunch of startups that are trying to do mass shared 3D printing and fabrication using blockchain to control all the intellectual property. All of these you see right now are already in full existence turnkey solutions, or are in proof of concept, meaning that there are already big players that are using these to see if they can use it. And again, the whole point of this session isn't to make you a genius on the underpinnings of every one of these. It's to point out you maybe need to look a little further over the event horizon, because when this comes, it comes really fast. If the people downstream from you basically say, we're not going to accept your products unless you're in this, you have to understand what it is, what it means, and how do you get ready. And so in some cases, you might actually start making some decisions in your business about what are we going to do to make sure that when this comes, we can be first plugged in. That might improve your relations with whoever that is that you're working with. It takes their other 50 suppliers a year to figure out how to get on this, and you're on within a month. Good things happen. Yes, sir.
In terms of the transactions that are happening, a lot of these things in those are small transactions.
Yep.
What about high transactions? So you got your cucumber, and that's a lot of transactions.
Yep.
Blockchain actually handle that.
That is every cucumber that's ever produced in the United States, and I transact every one of those, every hand it touches all the way through the food supply chain, is a fraction of the number of transactions that are going on in the cryptocurrency market right now. You literally could probably never produce the number of transactions that are so rapid that you would break the blockchain, because cryptocurrency. Yep. But again, all that is tied down to literally the size of the blockchain is how many transactions that are going on. What cryptocurrency has proven is that it can handle absolutely ungodly numbers of transactions. Eventually, it'll run into trouble. Everything we're talking here that have to do with physical goods is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the number of transactions of cryptocurrency at any point in time. So again, all cryptocurrency did, whatever the fate is of cryptocurrency, it is proven that the math is unarguable and that it's scalable. That's really all it done is proven what blockchain can do. So as an example, this is a working group amongst the airline industry right now, where they're defining critical parts in the airline production industry. Like what parts could fail that literally could bring down a plane. And there's this consensus forming in that community that those, probably within the next 18 months or so, pieces that are designated as being critical. So it's not the toilet on the plane, but it's probably the rivets holding down the panels on the wing. It will not be allowed to enter the supply chain for the airline industry unless they are not signed and trackable on the blockchain. So this is a proof of concept that's going on right now. But when we talk about how fast this can occur, this is already, so when you start talking Unilever and Dole and some of these others in the food community, those are the titans of the food community. They're doing that as a proof of concept right now. They're thrilled with how it's gone. When they literally raised their hand and said, this is done, this is a done deal, everybody's going to do this, everybody in that community is going to do it or you're out of business. You already have the airline industry that is already working through this, and they are basically, or the early indications are they're very happy with how it's working. Basically, they're starting to ferret out counterfeit parts that are showing up in the supply chain, refurbished parts, where someone's taking something off of another plane, cleaned it up, polished it up, and tried to put it back into the supply chain as new. Imagine that you're flying on a 737 where one of the rotor bits or something like that, where they're literally the lifetime on it is like 10,000 hours of flight before it has to be removed. Someone took one off of another plane that already had 11,000 hours on it, and they just polished it up and put it back into the community as new, and someone's going to try and put another 10,000 hours on it. That's how you get blown up engines. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to use it to ferret out counterfeit parts or manufacturing defects in the process. If all of a sudden the Airbuses and Boeings of the world say, this has too much benefit to us, we are dictating that you are all going to do this, everybody in the community is going to do it. If the airline industry is going to do it, you tell me how far behind you think the auto industry is going to be. So again, all I'm trying to do with this presentation is this doesn't convince you that you suddenly need to run out and do blockchain right now. I don't even know what that means to tell you, go do blockchain. All I'm trying to tell you is you have to probably start thinking at a business level, what is this going to mean to you when suddenly you get that quick pivot downstream from you? So what is it, besides the dictate of doing it, why would you ever actually get into blockchain yourself? Better inventory management. Who on your factory floor has those vending machines now where somebody goes up and they punch in their employee code and it spits out some piece, where before you just had the giant massive supply room that oddly half your inventory disappeared every 6 months and nobody knew why? Well, that was better inventory management. Well, now if you literally take that vending machine concept all the way through the entire life cycle, you literally know where every piece is at any moment in time. That's a huge benefit. Less paperwork. We already have proof of concepts underway for smart shipping. There are ports in the US, Southeast Asia, and Europe that are on the early proof of concept for smart shipping, where when something is packed at a factory, it starts getting tracked there, it gets all the way to the port, It gets validated at the port, put into a shipping container. They seal the shipping container with the tamper-proof, everything they put onto it. You know, your mileage may vary on your faith in that. They digitally sign the shipping container of what the contents are that they've tracked all the way from the factory. So essentially what you're trying to say is there's no contraband, counterfeit goods, whatever it's going to be. When it shows up at port, this has nothing to do with you at the moment, but when it shows up at port, Customs has agreed that if they can validate the transaction all the way through, the shipping will have expedited clearance through Customs in the port. They drop it straight onto a truck, which drives it straight to the factory that it's going to. So essentially you're taking the physical goods of cross-border transaction, and Customs in multiple nations are agreeing that if they can get this down where they all have faith that contraband's not being introduced, and you know the content mathematically provable of what's in that shipping container, it literally is direct transport from wherever it was to wherever it's going. Better understanding of the history of any part, that's the big one. And your competitors then to start doing massive data analysis on the blockchain to see how the ecosystem is working. What products are going where, of what type, of what quantity, whatever it's going to be. Pros and cons to that. That's a little bit of market intelligence that you need to expose to be part of this. So you're like, you know, it's always that typical conversation. I want to know what all my competitors are doing. I don't want them to know what I'm doing. This sort of lets everybody know what everybody's doing. But either way, there are groups now, there are startups that are blockchain startups that don't do anything blockchain. All they do is grab all the other blockchain ledgers and do data mining and market analysis through this so they can come back to you and try and sell you market analysis of what all your competitors are doing. At the end of the day, for any of these, it's either all in or all out. You have to get critical mass. You have to get enough participants in the community for a blockchain to work. The more people that are in the community, the better it works. The faster everything works, the faster all the transactions are cleared. Make sense? All right, I got one more slide, and I guess we'll take a couple minutes for Q&A. This is the pain of losing that first 20 minutes for the delay. Brass tacks, how do you know if a blockchain implementation is right for you? Spoiler alert, it's not always going to be the right answer. The blockchain vendors are always going to tell you it's the right answer. It comes down to pretty much these. Are there multiple parties involved that have some lack of total trust in each other? That is usually the one binary piece. If it's an individual, like inside your company, and you've got oversight over it and all tracking, whatever, one single database might pretty much work. That was the argument. I mentioned the blockchain panel I was on a couple weeks ago. An experienced blockchain lead was in the room. He was the first one to say the first 3 projects in Experian that were brought to him that they wanted to put on the blockchain, he shot down all 3 of them. His concept was a database in our organization will solve all of this much faster, much cheaper, much easier. The concept was everybody got so wrapped around the thing of what blockchain was is they didn't really ask themselves, why would you ever actually use it? It's a tool like anything else. I have a hammer, a screwdriver, a saw, whatever. I use each of them for their job. If you have a mixed population and lack of trust, a centralized database is rarely going to work because there's always allegations that the parties don't trust each other. Who's maintaining the database? Who's tracking it? Who's the record keeper? And how do I know you're not trying to screw me? In blockchain, when everything's written out to this publicly shared ledger, now all of a sudden it might make sense. Does the system need to be centralized? This typically goes back to the population question. If it's inside your little bubble of your business, everybody can touch a central authority, it's okay. But if all of a sudden, again, think of the food industry, that we're, you know, Dole or General Mills is a lot like saying GM. GM doesn't make every single piece that goes into every one of those cars. Every one of those pieces came from somebody else, and the pieces of that came from somebody else, and the raw components of that came from somewhere else. So there is no centralized authority, and so suddenly a blockchain might make sense. The big piece on that one, is there an issue of central trust with the authority? Is there an issue of trust with a centralized authority? Does the data need to be preserved forever, and it can never be altered? If you're tracking something where it's, gee whiz, this is interesting, but if I lost that file, I really don't care, blockchain is probably not what you're looking for. If 20 years from now, I need to prove that that transaction occurred and every party agreed, blockchain, all the way. You literally 20 years from now can go back and rerun all the math and mathematically prove that this transaction occurred or was agreed upon. Is transaction speed not a critical factor? And I throw this one out there, sir, straight to your point. Once the blockchain starts hitting a certain size, it can take a couple seconds, a couple minutes, whatever it might be, a couple hours, for everybody to mass consensus clear the transaction and agree. If this is a shipping container coming in, it's going to sit in a port for 2 days before it gets loaded onto a cargo ship, I don't care. If this is some type of real-time critical like transaction between sensors or something like that, blockchain might be nice to validate it, but it might slow it down. So really at the end of the day, what it comes down to is if it needs to be real-time or near real-time, blockchain might not be your answer because the longer the blockchain is in play, the slower the transactions are. But if this is me agreeing to sell a production facility to another company, you're probably not waiting to the second that is critical, that transaction occurs. You probably have an hour to work with somewhere in there. All right, and with that, I guess I was just going to go to questions and answers. I think we're at our time, but I got nowhere to go. Sir.
So understand, like the cryptocurrency, every participant has access to your pair, right?
Yep.
If it's a private blockchain that say General Motors created, would that always be the case that every participant's going to have the ability to do that, right?
It depends on how they build it. There are concepts on blockchains that are abstracted, where I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it. You end up with a bunch of black boxes, where what happens in the black boxes you can't see, but you can see a mathematically signed output saying whatever happened in the black box, here's the signature for it. It's kind of a blockchain that's segmented out, and you can see. So people are trying to come up with a way to do a blockchain, again, with the benefit of blockchain, meaning the ledger is provable by everybody, but not making every transaction visible to everybody. And so people are trying to do something along the lines of, if a transaction is only between two individual parties, there's a way to hide exactly what the nature of the transaction was, but you produce a signature saying the transaction occurred. And if there's ever a challenge, you can come back and open the box and prove what the transaction was. But you can start to see now I am not just storing the results of the general ledger. I actually have to store the details of each individual transaction and hide them, which takes the processing and storage and just blows it out. So people are trying to come up with ways to do it. Really, at the end of the day, when they do a private blockchain, you're pretty much saying whoever's in that private little bubble, everybody can see everybody's business, but the rest of the internet can't. Where something like Bitcoin, the general ledger is shared internet. At any moment in time, I can go grab the Bitcoin general ledger. A private one means the ledger is just contained inside that population. Ma'am. So the story on this one is going to be pretty much every 6 months, some major exchange gets hacked into and somebody steals all the Bitcoin, all the cryptocurrency. What it comes down to is, I'm going to go back to this picture. The whole point of doing a blockchain is a distributed ledger, and get away from a central clearinghouse that suddenly can lose my money, somebody can commit fraud, move it, whatever it's going to be. When you hear about the exchanges, Coinbase, Kraken, there's all these others that are out there. There are people that use it. They hold on to their wallet, meaning their cryptocurrency, on their local computer, and all they do is when they make a transaction through this is they just move however much they need in there into the clearinghouse to clear the transaction, and it gets moved. There are other people, I know people that have $100,000 in Bitcoin, and they don't even own a laptop. What they did is you have the option to store it in the exchange. And what you do is you actually check in with them and say, it's almost literally, they turn it into a bank, a central bank. And what you do is you go to the bank and say, hey, I need $100,000 in cash, because I'm going to go buy a Maserati or whatever. So what happened is somebody hacked into the exchange, and all those people that were storing their Bitcoin there locally like it was a bank, they just literally stole the money. They went into the general ledger and approved a transaction saying they moved all that over to their account. And remember, the ledger doesn't say whether it's good, bad, or wrong, or whatever. It doesn't say I convinced you to move cryptocurrency because I was beating you with a wrench. It just says you agreed to do it. So when they broke into the exchange, they just said, I'm the exchange, and I approve moving this $1 billion in cryptocurrency to these other accounts. So what happened was people wanted to be dealing with Bitcoin, but they didn't want to have their own ledger, their own whatever, and so they turned Bitcoin back into a banking model, which means somebody could rob the bank. So essentially, they took what was supposed to look like that, and they turned it back into that, which means somebody can show up and rob the bank. Again, it's all mathematical, but it's the same thing as walking in with a gun and taking it. But you would never have, but that has nothing to do with the blockchain underneath it. All the blockchain did is record validly that somebody moved X amount of currency from this account to that account. The transaction was completely valid and provable. It doesn't say that it was done maliciously or somebody stole my password or whatever it was going to be. The blockchain worked perfectly. It validated that the transaction occurred. It didn't validate the morality of the transaction. Okay, again, careful. The conversation is going back to cryptocurrency, not blockchain. Cryptocurrency is currency. And yes, there's already regulation pending for it. The IRS has already said it's taxable. So again, so if you're going to use blockchain, which is just signing transactions, the regulations are going to be specific to whatever that is. So if I'm signing a contract and recording on the blockchain that all parties agreed to this contract and it's irrefutable, back to the law goes back to the law of the contract. Can you prove that the contract was wrong or whatever? The blockchain is irrelevant. It signed that you guys, it acknowledged that you guys agreed to this contract. Nobody can pretend they didn't. Nobody can, like when we see fraud, so I run the digital forensics team. We'll have somebody that will take a contract, decide later that they don't like it. They will take their local copy, rewrite the wording of the contract, and then what they'll do is go into court and say, no, mine's the right contract, yours is wrong. You've got the fraudulent, and all of a sudden you're in the argument about who's got the real contract. Well, with blockchain, there is, no, literally, this was the contract. We made a digital signature. It's a, so the law on any part of blockchain has nothing to do with blockchain. It's everything to do with the application that's sitting on top of it. Really? I don't like you. You're asking all the hard questions. Too early in the morning. Yep. The concept was net neutrality. Essentially, the net neutrality that was just revoked, that essentially says Comcast, Xfinity, AT&T, the people that control the pipes of the internet, they get to make their own decisions on what traffic you get to see. Like literally, if you try to view one of their competitors, they can simply say, well, I own this pipe and I don't like my competitor, you can't visit their webpage. And they revoke the law that says they can't do that. Or look at Comcast. Comcast is hemorrhaging money because people are cutting off cable and doing Netflix and streaming. Comcast doesn't like that. So now they can go into their pipe and literally say, we're going to cut, anytime you try to stream a video from Netflix, we can slow it down to 1/10 of the speed so that you get pissed off, so that it'll force you back onto cable TV. So net neutrality with this, now imagine somebody has a vested interest in controlling something like Bitcoin or one of the cryptocurrencies. They can slow down your transactions and force it so that they are always first. So that was the big issue behind net neutrality, is essentially it turns the people that control the pipes into the masters of the internet. They can decide what they want you to see or want you to do, and they can decide otherwise, and there's nothing you can do about it. Yep. You can clear the transaction, you can make money, you can front run everybody, which is illegal in the stock market. If I operate with information that you don't have and I trade on it and it's not publicly accessible, that's illegal. What they just did in net neutrality is essentially it puts all of the cable companies in the position they can front run everybody on the internet. They will have the information before you do, slow it down before you see it, and they can make business decisions before you do. And just this isn't theoretical. They are already marketing this to other companies, saying that they can provide them information in real time and slow it down for your competitors, which everybody's basically saying that should be blatantly illegal, but it's not yet, so they're doing it. So all blockchain will do in that one is let you know that there was probably a delay in this. You just won't be able to do anything about it. I don't care. It's a little hard questions. All right, ma'am. It can be established a bunch of different ways. Again, in cryptocurrency, you can choose to try to remain anonymous, but what happens there is you can't ever do a transaction. The underground market term is docs, document you. So again, the guys that were ordering literally shipments of cocaine on the underground market, and then they used that same Bitcoin account to go order a pizza where they recorded their name and address. Not the sharp bowling ball, you know, in the shed there from an intellectual capability. On the private ones, you're probably, they're always going to know who the other people are unless they want it to remain anonymous. So if all of a sudden, like in the logistics community, Dole knows every single person, so every one of those identities, they know which vendor that represents, you might end up in situations, to your point, where you don't want people knowing who's committing what transaction, that they also give you an anonymous ID that's not tied to you personally. That ID is just a digital signature. It's a giant, ridiculously long, complex mathematical string that when you present that, it says, this is who I am. That's pretty much, you can tie it to a device, you can tie it to an account. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Sir?
I would think that there's two aspects of this. One is the supply chain, so
Yep.
the other end is, say, if your supplier and you have to push this down. You mentioned earlier, you want to advance, you want to prepare
Mm-hmm.
for this, right? And get this sort of pushed down. What are some of the things you want to do to prepare yourself?
Probably the first one I'd recommend is make sure that you are talking to them a lot and asking, hey, what initiatives they have going on or whatever, because in some cases, it's going to be hard for you to prepare because you don't know what technology they're going to use. Are they going to go out and contract with IBM or GuardTime or one of these other, you know, turnkey ones, and they're just going to say, we're going to use this? Or are they going to roll their own? I mean, so you don't know what the technology is. The more you can talk to them and figure out, A, is this an initiative? What are you planning on? What's it probably going to look like? You can start to prep for it. It's irrelevant of what solution they pick. What you're probably going to have to start to prepare to do is however they're going to define like by unit tracking. So if all of a sudden you produce, you know, wiring harnesses and they say we want to track, you know, a crate of them, or do we want to track individual units or whatever it's going to be, you're going to have to start to figure out in your business, what do you need to do? I mean, are you automatically like scanning serial numbers or batch numbers or whatever it's going to be? You have to figure out like how are you going to start to get to the level they want of tracking and recording. So you would probably have to start to prep, irrelevant of which one they pick. How can you track what you think they're going to get to? Is that by unit, by whatever, so that when they say, okay, we're going to do this, you can say, that's fine. Just tell me what blockchain you're going to use. And usually it's a little pretty simple, you know, soft piece of software that you would scan your piece and it would write it to the blockchain. You just have to make sure that you're ready to track to that level. That's probably the biggest piece. Now, where it's going to start getting complex is when they start telling you that you need to do the same thing with your suppliers. Now you need to start talking with them to make sure they can track to the level. You know, all of a sudden we're talking, is it a basket of wiring harnesses? Is it an individual wiring harness? Is it the copper in the individual wires in the wiring harness? You need to figure out what level of granularity they're going to get down to. For smart contracts and stuff like that, that's going to be a little bit interesting because usually there's not much you can do until they can tell you what exactly technology they want to use to drive it. Sir?
This sounded to me a little bit like the old EDI, where it's driven down the supply chain, and you really needed to integrate it into your ERP system.
Yep.
And I hear kind of the same thing. A lot of companies are already tracking either at the lot or serial level.
Yep.
The components, the receiving and shipping. But getting that information out to the blockchain.
A plugin, something that plugs the two pieces together.
Right.
Yep.
Something plugged into your ERP system. You don't want to be.
Yep.
Are you aware of the ERP vendors doing anything?
Yes. So IBM and Oracle are already working together to try to plug some stuff together. SAP is already playing in this space as well. And that's what I'm saying, when you start talking about the pressure is going to come from the top down, the big players in those spaces, they very well see that this is going to come. And what they're actually trying to do is position themselves to get you even more bound to their product. So now all of a sudden, if you're tracking this and you're dropping it into like an ERP system, and that ERP system comes out and they say, no, we have this module that will literally take that data and push it up to, you know, General Motors' new blockchain, you're now even more wound into their product. You're less likely to get away from their product and something else, because now all of a sudden, if that other product doesn't support this, now you're back to doing dual entry and whatever it's going to be. So one of the biggest signs that this is probably for real is all of the business apps are probably a year into development to develop all these plugins to make sure that when this goes live, they can wave their flag and say, no, you've already got it. It's already here. Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think a year into it, how much further do they have to go before they're ready?
I actually say most of them, depending on what the solution is, could be there very, very quickly. What they're afraid of is, remember how I threw up the graphic saying there's 1,500 cryptocurrency? What they're afraid of is pretty much what happens when GM, Ford, Chrysler, all these others all come up with their own rather than using individual. And now Airbus does, and then Lockheed does, and then Boeing does. And then what they're afraid of is they can solve for, like, if somebody settles on one or two or three of the big blockchain platforms out there right now. Like I said, IBM, GuardTime, there's several others that a bunch of groups are using that to underpin what they're doing. They want everybody to kind of centralize on some standardized technology. If everybody suddenly rolls their own, that's their big fear. Yep. Yeah, because the concept behind blockchain, I know we're talking about the math a little bit. The math can get complex. The concept is super simple, though. If I just take all these transactions and just do pure addition, if I took all the transactions and took all the numbers, at this second, there was 50 transactions, and when I add up all the numbers, it was a total of $1.576 million that was moved. I just added them up. That 1.5 whatever, I just moved to the next transaction, and it's bundled into the next transaction. Well, at any point in time where someone manipulated it, all of a sudden my addition doesn't work. The concept's really simple. I just run the math, come up with a number, and the number feeds into the next transactions, and so it's trackable. The concept of blockchain is really simple. The implementation, when everybody does it their own way, suddenly becomes impossible, where I'm trying to match 1,500.
Is it really the simplest form of blockchain is transaction traceability?
That's it. When you take blockchain and throw everything else away, all it does is prove mathematically that a transaction happened in a point in time between certain parties, and that's it. Nobody can ever disprove that it didn't happen. That's it. If all the math, throw it away. It literally is a mathematical source of truth. That's it. And so,
I was kind of thinking, I don't know what this gentleman's name is, but there's an awful lot, the traceability, there's an awful lot of traceability going on now that's pretty, not bulletproof maybe, but it's pretty good with serial number and lot number and all that sort of thing. And this is just trying to put another layer of validation on that.
well, what it does is take that simple case where you're tracking inventory, now tie it to smart contracts. Now I don't want to just prove that this piece came from some person. I want to prove all these people came from all these people, and we agreed that when it got to point A, all those people would get paid. And so now take that traceability and now say, what else can I do it? If I can automate traceability, well, can I now automate tracking, payments, agreements, clearing? That's what they're trying to do with blockchain, is they're trying to use that traceability and be able to do actionable things off of it. Yep. So again, traceability, but now turning the smart shipping containers that I was talking about, where if everybody agrees that if we come up with a tamper-proof way to do this, that I know right now everything that's in that shipping container, and all of a sudden I don't have to worry about customs because they just scan it, and they say the blockchain says it's this, and it goes. Your logistics just drastically changed. Man. An easy one, right? Easy. Okay. So what you can do is you can go all in. And when I'm saying all in, it's the community. It's not your entire business. So let's say that all you're going to do off this one is parts tracing. And it's a GM or Ford or whatever says we want to be able to trace any individual part all the way back down through the supply chain. They need their entire community in, but that might be the only thing they're doing is parts tracing. Now when you start talking about, well, growing, well, once you do that, well, now let's start adding in smart transactions, smart contracts, smart shipping, smart whatever. You pick one problem you're trying to solve, and the entire community has to be in on solving that one problem. Each individual problem you can then kind of bolt on to whatever you're doing for that. But you can't just say we're doing parts traceability and we're just going to have 2 or 3 people playing in, because the people that aren't in, you still don't trust them. That's the issue that comes down to it. Yep. Once the population is large enough and everybody's validating everybody's work, again, that's where the airline industry and the food industry, they went from 0 to 60. It was one shot. When they decided this works for us and you're going to do it, that's it. Everybody in. And if you're not in, that's fine. You don't need to be. We're not going to do business with you. Guess, so guess how that worked out.
Is it possible to get this?
Oh, absolutely. Yep, I can either send them to you individually, or I just send them to Automation Alley and they can distribute them. Every industry is going to be different. Right now, we're seeing anything to do with major, physical stuff, shipping, foodstuffs, food and retail, food and beverage or retail, manufacturing, whatever. It's top-down driven. In the area, again, it varies by industry. In the high-tech space, it's the middle, because people are saying that, oh, you want to borrow my source code? Let's sign it on the blockchain. And so you have the Googles and Microsofts and others of the world that want to use a chunk of source code that's not open source, and rather than going through and contracting it, they're doing smart contracts or whatever. So it's weird. Some industries, you're watching it driven from the middle out. Other industries, it's from the top down. You don't see from the bottom up, because to the people on the bottom of the period, it's a gigantic pain in the ass, and they don't want to do it. Yeah.
GPU's getting sort of like power struggles between, let's say, Ford saying use this blockchain, plus them saying we are only going to validate use this. Who essentially then controls the flow?
Oh, it's ugly right now. Nobody wants to talk about it, but there's basically just pure knife fighting going on under the hood. Everybody wants to be the source of truth that controls the blockchain. And so, again, you've got a bunch of the cryptocurrencies. And everybody, you just have to laugh at the politics of it. How many years was it now that the banks have been like, don't trust cryptocurrency, it's crap, it's a fraud, it's a Ponzi scheme, don't do it, whatever. Now every single one of them is coming out with their own blockchain, their own version of cryptocurrency. They don't call it cryptocurrency. It's abstracted, value exchange or whatever. No, it's cryptocurrency. It literally is exactly the same thing, but they've spent so long basically saying it's garbage, they don't want to say they're doing their own cryptocurrency. Now, they're all basically saying, well, we have the only trustworthy blockchain, that Bitcoin stuff, whatever. It's a bunch of hackers that control that. You don't trust them, so now they're bad-mouthing the other one, trying to get you to jump onto theirs. It's how everybody that suddenly is realizing what this can do now all of a sudden wants to be the source of truth. They're trying to convince everybody else to jump onto their blockchain first, where you're starting to see the big, powerful companies that are dictating all of our suppliers are going to use this one. That's really the only thing that's sorting it out. Eventually, you might see some regulators starting to weigh on it. That'll make a difference as well.
And then sort of like the role of IBM, Amazon, Microsoft, their role as either the platform or the infrastructure for it.
Yep.
Are they sort of forcing their own hand as well to say, you have to use ours as our platform or our infrastructure?
They're not saying you have to. The model right now is they're trying to incentivize you. So take Amazon as an example. It's no secret to anybody. So they've been building out blockchain solutions within Amazon Web Services. Well, hey guys, if you already host all of your stuff in AWS, we have all these contracts or whatever. No, it's already there. This thing is there, waiting for you. Turn the key, turn it on, it's ready for you. A little added upcharge, why don't you use ours? And Amazon, Rackspace, IBM, all these other big players, they're all trying to do the same thing. It's a race to mass. Whoever can hit critical mass first is then going to start dictating to the other groups of, hey, we understand you're over there in their hosted services, whatever, but nobody's using their blockchain, they're all using ours. If you want a centralized authority, start flipping over to us. No, it's just like any other product that's ever come where all of a sudden everybody jumps on it at once. They're all trying to convince everybody to use yours. All right? I'm starting to see people leave. I apologize if it got a little complex up front, but you guys can see where I tried to say what cryptocurrency was and what blockchain was, and then throw cryptocurrency to the side, because we can get all sorts of bizarre conversations about that. The concept behind blockchain is what we're trying to drive in. So, good? Everybody all right?
You've got an awful lot of talk with somebody with an IQ of -4.
I'll take that as a compliment. I'm not going to make any comment on your IQ, though. So my guess is you wouldn't be sitting in the room if that was true. Yep. So I'm available for individual questions, or I can make all the material available as well.
Damien will be available for individual. Plus, I wanted to let you know that while he was in here speaking, I was talking to Lori down in, as a marketing person, to make sure that we can get him to speak at our Integrate conference in November. So we're trying to clear your calendar and make that happen.
I will.
So if y'all want to hear more about him, you'll come back.
I will bring more examples, I guess. I might even do some live examples to drive the point home and show what it is.
I'm going to let everyone know where Integrate is.
I actually sat in a course where they had more time. They had 2 hours. they literally did a live example in the audience using poster board, where everybody would write down numbers and they'd hold it up, and then they would take everybody around them and you would add up all their numbers and do whatever, and you write on your poster board and you hold up the next one, and before long you could see it where every one of your transactions was based on everybody around you, and you could reverse the transactions and prove it. It was actually pretty slick, but it took about half an hour to get the point, and I didn't want to do that here. So, all right, I guess everybody go forth and conquer. I'll stick around for a little bit. I have no urge to go drive in the rain. Yeah, if you give me your business cards, I'll send it straight to you. Otherwise, I'm not sure what the distribution policy is for Automation Alley, but these are available. I'll just make them available to whoever wants them.
Good job.
It's hard to do a dumbed-down version of PhD level math, but I try. So, okay. Actually, here we can do this. I'll just throw my cards out here if you guys want it. Just grab one of my cards and email me, and we'll go from there. All right. If anybody wants the slides, just grab one of my cards and email me. That might be the easier way to do it.
Okay.
So, thank you. You were nodding the whole time, so I assumed I was making sense.
I have read up
Got
a
it.
little bit on this because some of our clients are trying to use blockchain for patents,
Yes.
for IP,
Again,
for
imagine.
network security.
Yep.
And whatnot.
So
And
imagine
it's
that you can take a blob of data.
Yeah, it's a recording scheme
That's it.
that you cannot dispute about.
If you've got a legal background,
Yeah.
this is essentially a notary on steroids.
Wonderfully put. Very well put.
It's pretty, yeah, it's pretty, yeah,
That's right.
yeah. It is a globally visible, provable notary.